Hello. Today, we will begin Module 3, Foundational Documents in American Democracy. We will cover Principles of the American Political System in this section, which will be the only one for Module 3. You will learn about some of the major works that appeared in the Revolutionary Era, their ideas, and how those ideas influenced the founding of the country. So, let's get started. With more and more American colonists seriously considering separating from England in 1774, delegates were elected to a Continental Congress, which met from September to October. The second meeting convened in Philadelphia in May 1775. As the delegates debated, Thomas Paine added his own views to the overall discussion with common sense. Between January and April 1776, 120,000 copies of this 47-page pamphlet were sold. An amazing statistic when you consider the American colonies was comprised of 3 million people. Pamphlets were the most prevalent mode of publishing in the 18th century since it provided an avenue for anyone who could afford the cost of paper and print shop fees. By the end of the Revolution, an estimated 500,000 copies of Common Sense had been sold. Paine refrained from presenting abstract concepts. Instead, he wrote his work in a style that was accessible by people from all walks of life, especially the common folk. He eloquently brought the case for independence to the public and helped to shift the sentiment toward revolution. One of the key points of Paine's work was the colony's independence from England. At the time, there was debate over whether the American colonies should continue to oppose the Crown's policies while still remaining British subjects, or to declare independence from the mother country. Paine came down squarely on the side of independence. Supporting this central claim, Paine ridiculed the idea of hereditary monarchy and its inherent stability as absurd. Another point was the creation of a democratic republic. Paine asserted the purpose of government is to serve the people. America is the land of freedom, and a people's greatest power is in their unified accomplishments. Americans had an exceptional opportunity to alter the course of history by creating a new form of government in which people freely ruled themselves. It's important to note that, at this same time, shots had already been fired between colonial militia and British soldiers at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker and Breed Hills. Paine said, "We have every opportunity and every encouragement before us, to form the noblest purest constitution on the face of the earth. We have it in our power to begin the world over again." On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution in the Second Continental Congress that called for the American colonies to declare independence. The text of the resolution stated, "Resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. That it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances. That a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation." The resolution proposed 3 steps: a declaration of independence, a call to secure alliances with foreign countries, and a plan to adopt a constitution for a new American Confederation. In response, the Congress appointed 3 committees on June 11. One to draft a Declaration of Independence. This would become known as the Committee of 5 and include John Adams, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston of New York, and Thomas Jefferson. Another committee was to draw up a plan for foreign alliances, and a third to prepare and digest the form of a confederation. Many members of the Congress believed the actions in Lee's resolution to be premature or wanted instructions from their constituents before voting, so approval was postponed until July 2. Jefferson was the primary author of the declaration. Adams and Franklin offered some stylistic revisions while Sherman and Livingston seem to have been satisfied with the draft. As we have discussed previously, the principles contained within the documents were equality, unalienable rights, and consent of the governed. The Declaration, and Jefferson himself, was influenced by Rousseau's social contract theory and Locke's principles of life, liberty, and property. We covered the Declaration in Module 2, so we will move on to the Articles of Confederation. Similar to the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation stemmed from the Lee Resolution. The Articles were the first governing system of the United States, and they went into effect in 1781. This document was described as being a League of Friendship rather than a national government. Some of the strengths of the Articles include the establishment of a framework for union, and an acknowledgement of state sovereignty. Some of the weaknesses were the lack of central authority, which led to inefficiency and disunity. The overemphasis on state sovereignty likewise weakened central governance. A weak central government that lacked an active chief executive or judiciary. The Congress had only one chamber, and each state had only one vote. Any legislation needed a supermajority of 9 of the 13 states to pass. The document required unanimous consent for amendments, which was a practical impossibility. The central government had no mechanism for collecting taxes to fund operations. Following the revolution, the states attempted to dissolve their bonds between each other and become their own sovereign powers. Each had printed its own paper money during the revolution, which became debased. Attempts to save the currency by way of legal tender laws, price fixing, and anti-monopoly legislation failed in the end. This inability to repay the country's debts to European countries led to a reluctance for further loans. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and other revolutionary leaders recognized the need for a stronger national government. They also saw the need to alter the existing confederation into something better and more stable. Assembling in Philadelphia in 1787, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention initially intended to revise the Articles, but adjourned 4 months later with a new constitution in hand. There was no common consensus on the shape and scope of the new government. The preservation of life, liberty, and property remained their key objectives. The two major factions were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were typically highly educated, wealthy lawyers and merchants who lived in cities. The Anti-Federalists were normally small farmers and residents of more rural areas. The name Anti-Federalist was not one they adopted, rather it was one used to group together all who opposed the ratification of the Constitution. The debates about ratification grew tense and spilled out from Constitutional Hall into towns and villages throughout the country. Sometimes, these arguments became violent. However, there was a famous and revealing debate that appeared in the newspapers as 2 series of essays. Each was collected according to its ideological outlook. The essays that favored the Federalist viewpoint were known as the Federalist Papers. Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay emphasized in them that federalism is essential for managing a diverse and expansive republic. As noted throughout this video series, the framers were men educated in the classics. James Madison looked to ancient and modern history and political science to find feasible models. He finally concluded that there was no perfect archetype and later noted, "It has been shown that the other confederacies which could be consulted as precedents have been vitiated by the same erroneous principles, and can therefore furnish no other light than that of beacons, which give warning of the course to be shunned, without pointing out that which ought to be pursued." He realized that confederacies were too weak to govern properly and collapsed under their internal dissension. However, more authoritarian forms of government could become too powerful and trample on the rights of their citizens. The balance was to create a central government with the necessary powers to handle national issues while preserving the sovereignty of the states. The Anti-Federalists likewise included a collection of thoughtful and sophisticated thinkers, such as Constitutional Convention delegate Robert Yates, poet and historian Mercy Otis Warren, Richard Henry Lee, and Samuel Bryan. They opposed the new constitution because they believed too much power was being invested in the federal government. A major concern was whether ordinary citizens would be able to participate in the government. The danger was that out-of-touch political elites would seize power and trample on the rights of the states. Remember, for many years, Americans believed that the government that was closest to the people was the best. Were the Anti-Federalists correct? As Amar points out in his 1993 article, one could make this argument, but only after referencing a lengthy series of constitutional changes that occurred years after the founding era. With the beginning of the Civil War, for instance, the federal government gathered unto itself a great deal of executive authority. The Anti-Federalists had the harder goal to obtain. They had no alternative to the Articles of Confederation while the Federalists had the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists could not halt the ratification of the Constitution in 1789. However, in time, they would be able to insert their concerns into the final draft. We'll talk about this more in the next module. Next time? This wraps up Module 3. Now that you understand some of the underlying theory of the Constitution, we will move to the next module and discuss the American system in practice. Until then, thank you for your time. If you want to learn more about the subjects we have discussed, here are the sources used for this section.